Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Ben Garfinkel, and I am Strategy Director and Principal at Industrial Brand, a brand strategy and consulting firm. I'm joined today by Mark Bussey, Managing Director and Principal. Say hi, Mark.
Hello, everyone.
We're going to get started in a moment. We know everyone's busy, so we'll stick to our promise to finish within an hour. Just before we start, I want to bring your attention to the questions window on your screens. If you have questions for us or our panel during this webinar, just type them in and we'll do our best to get them in. Also, note the chat window where we'll be posting some relevant info as we go. Okay, so our last webinar was meant to provoke thought about whether the classic names on the door convention, so prevalent in AEC, needs to be replaced. If you're thinking it's indeed time to examine renaming, then this is the webinar for you. We're going to start with a brief introduction to the things that go into the naming process, and even a bit about name types, including how to evaluate options in the service of finalizing a choice. However, even more valuable, we feel, is hearing from three principals about their own paths through the naming process.
Ben, can you go ahead and put that text in the chat window for us? Just before we get started, folks, I hope everyone can hear us. If there's any difficulties, please let us know via chat or the questions window. We're here to help out and facilitate today. So the three folks we're having join us, we're really pleased to welcome our Heather Smith, who's the National Director of Business Development for Architecture 49. Her firm is formerly known as Smith Carter in Winnipeg. Chris Pollard is also here, and he's a principal at Ratio Architecture in Vancouver. They were formerly TRB Architecture. And of course, Tom Sutherland is the managing principal for DIALOG, and his firm was formerly Cohos Evamy. Let's begin by just for a second thinking about why a firm would rename itself. It's a huge undertaking, and it can be risky, of course. There are typically what we call triggering events. Triggering events can be a merger or acquisition, the combining of two firms with very distinctly different brands, often a departure or an arrival of a senior partner, especially when the firm is named after partners, which is quite common in the AEC sector, can be a triggering event. Expanding or entering new markets or specialties in other regions is often an ideal time to consider branding and messaging. And this often comes with significant scope and scale changes. Some names may not transfer well into new markets. And of course, just a stale corporate image. This one's a bit tricky, but when an organization is changing with the times, and if the image hasn't kept up and there's an update to appeal to changing audiences, a common thing we hear from our clients is that younger staff, younger clients, their priorities and preferences are changing, and sometimes a name change, an entire rebrand, may be in order to deal with that. And of course, if a firm's positioning has changed in a market, if there's a newer refined identity needed to better reflect their focus or a specialty or capabilities, this may be the time for a change. The bottom line really is that there are many reasons why a professional services firm or a company of any sort would want to rename. But I want to make a note here that there are just as many reasons why they should not. The trick is really to be as pragmatic and strategic about the choice. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Thanks, Mark. The naming process. Well, it's once the brand position and strategy is in place, naming can begin. It's definitely a complex process, and while sometimes a name can come right out of thin air or as one of those brilliant genius insights that you sometimes get, it is really an iterative process, and it's complicated. Objectivity is critical in this process. Well, client input and things like regional and cultural considerations are considered, navigating that emotional, subjective response among decision makers is one of the most challenging aspects we face when we're doing naming. The other part of this, and part of the objectivity really, as we're honing in on naming options, is to become more critical. We need to maintain objectivity and focus on that brand strategy. And to do that, we employ an evaluative scoring process to rank shortlisted options. This includes such things as considering how a name will look, how it will sound, how it appeals to the intended audience, and the fit within the positioning of the firm and the brand. We'll get into this a little bit more shortly. The other one that's really important is, even if you do have a brilliant naming suggestion or an idea that you want to go with, is it available? And we've had clients that availability is the #1 consideration for a .com URL. So there's different priorities that clients have about this, and availability is critical. We'll get more into that in a little bit as well. For us, when we do naming, our first stop on evaluating availability is using an online search, and then we consult with trademark lawyers. And of course, in the architecture and engineering industries, professional licensing bodies, such as the Architecture Institute, need to be a part of that process. Now, there's many ways to look at naming and naming conventions, and what we typically do is split naming into 4 basic types. First is functional and descriptive, and this is it. This is the most common form of AEC name, and it's usually a list of last names that we're all familiar with looking at, or an acronym followed by a descriptive modifier such as the word architecture or engineering. And in general, a name falls into this category if it's literal, if it's purely descriptive of what the company does. One of the disadvantages of this is that it requires more marketing dollars and effort to distinguish ourselves. A good example, not in the AEC industry, would be something like digital equipment. It is generic. The next category of name typology is an invented name. These are just made-up names. Usually they're based on Latin roots or a poetic rhythm. This type of name really does help us stand out from the crowd, but it's also more difficult to rationalize. An example would be Agilent, sort of a Latin-based name. It's an invented kind of merging of a couple of things, and Google, a sort of a poetic expression of something that was just made up. Experiential names is another name category, and it's more of an expression of the experience than the task itself. So they're often intuitive. They're owned in many different industries, so they're really often harder to claim outright. An example here would be names like Gateway, Navigator, Palm Pilot. For the purposes of our guest panels today, DIALOG would be an experiential name. And evocative names is our last category of name typology that we use. And this is one that evokes company positioning. It's not functional as a description or experience. They're names that bring to mind memories, stories, emotions, and they're often unique and powerful differentiators, but they're also the hardest ones to sell. Let's take a look at some of the specific examples that we've brought together here. And very interestingly, this is a combination of names that we've looked at from a number of different sources. And when I was looking at a recent top 100 list, I got to about the top 30 firms and found perhaps only one name, maybe 2 names that fell out of the functional and descriptive category. So this example chart that we have here is quite representative of probably the ratio of the name types within the industry to some degree. You can see that there's very little that I need to say here about the functional descriptive names. They're very obvious, the ones that we're all very used to. We have some invented names, AECOM, Stantec. They're kind of obvious, kind of mashups of the things that they do.
I absolutely love Arquitectonica. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
I could barely say it.
That is crazy.
Yeah. Barcode is a unique one in Winnipeg. They started out with the number of their corporate registry, which was also then visualized as a barcode, and it presented the challenge for them of being referred to as 5468796, and now they're oftentimes only referred to as barcode. So there's definitely considerations that need to be made when you're breaking out of the box. And ArcaZoom is another one that I found, which was interesting. Experiential names, these are ones that a couple of us are familiar with: Dialogue, Ratio, Design Collective. And one way to kind of tell if they're experiential is we talked about things that are words that are kind of everyday words that other industries have firms that are named that, but they really work oftentimes quite well for us in the AEC. And evocative names are, and I should also point out, some of these names don't always fit into the categories quite so cleanly. They can go into one or more of these. Evocative names like North 46, or as abbreviated as N46 or Architecture 49. For example, Architecture 49 is evocative because it's meant to call to mind the idea of the firm is based in Canada and the 49th parallel. So it fits there. But if we abbreviate it, maybe it becomes an invented name because A49 is an invented thing. Let's move on. So name evaluation. In the naming process, we can easily generate hundreds or even thousands of ideas and options. It's purposely chaotic and loose, but there comes a time when we need to introduce some order. This is where a more objective process is invaluable. We start to look at shortlisted names and evaluate them based on a selected criteria. We literally score the name on a scale from 1 to 10 and produce a ranking. Also, sometimes we need to do a weighted ranking based on characteristics we feel are the most important to a brand. For example, we may want a really warm, friendly, and approachable name, and so the score that we have on something like humanity would be way more important than another factor. So let's take a look at the criteria that we sometimes look at here. Appearance being the first one. As visual people, as a company that is going to be responsible for creating the visual identity of the names that we create most often, how the name looks is very important. How we'll look in a logo or an ad on a billboard, how these letters look together in lower and uppercase are really critical. The name's always going to be seen in context, but it's going to be seen. Looks are important. We also look for awkward spaces between letter forms and things like that, and try to make assessments that way. Distinctiveness. How differentiated the name is from its competition is a measure of this. It's only one element that goes into making a name memorable, but it's required. Since if a name's not distinct from a sea of similar names, it's just not going to be memorable. It's important when judging distinctiveness to always consider the name in the context of the product it will serve. And among the competition, it's going to spar for the consumer's attention or a client's attention. Depth. So depth is a challenging one. It's about layering meaning and association. Names with great depth never really reveal all they have to offer at once, but they do keep surprising you with new ideas. Energy. How vital and full of life is the name? Does it have pizzazz? Does it have buzz? Impact? Can it carry an ad campaign on its shoulders? These are all aspects of a name's energy level, and it is something that we look at. I mentioned humanity. This is literally the nature, the measure of the warmth of a name, how human it sounds. There's often cold, clinical, unemotional names. You see a lot of them in medical, in mechanical. A lot of engineering type names are that way, and it's something that is something we want to take a look at if that's a goal for us. The positioning of the name. This is a measure of the relevance the name has to the positioning of the product or company being named, the service offered, or the industry served. We want to know if there's relevant messages that the name maps to that we can use as a way to enter into descriptions about what the company does. And sound. This can be very important. Well, always existing in a context of some sort or another, the name's going to be heard. It's going to be just verbal sometimes. Radio, maybe. Television, maybe. Trade show presenting. You're at a conference. Telephone, very, very likely to be part of a cocktail conversation when you're networking. How a name sounds and how it's spoken and understood may mean the difference between clarity or being aggravated having to spell it out every single time you use it. Or maybe even misspelled. The URL. So when we're doing naming, we might have a great idea, but we do a rapid domain name search to see if there's availability for first choice obvious URLs, specifically .coms, .cos, .nets, and .ca instances. Usually, it also helps us find any companies that might be using the name and potential trademark red flags. And trademark red flags are very interesting because that's the next and most important part of this is if we get through all the hoops and we have a good name finalist and it turns out that it's simply not available to us, then we've got a problem. What we do is we look at whether or not a name is absolutely, clearly, seemingly available, possibly available, or not available at all. And if it's possibly available, that would mean that it looks like it might be unused, parked, possibly available to acquire. It might be being used in another industry, and that's where we start to look at consulting legal professional help that have experience in intellectual property. There are a couple of online search tools. I've just posted one in our chat window here for the Canadian Trademarks Database Search. It's a good one to start to use. Again, it's no substitute for proper professional legal advice in these matters. There's also an American one.
Okay, so we're going to get on with the panel discussion, but I just want to share with everybody a few considerations. Assuming you've gotten down to some finalists and your leadership team is trying to determine which name is the best. This is some basic considerations we like to use in that final push to get consensus on which is the best choice. It's easy to get caught up in structure and analytics and start second guessing yourself. And we've seen many times where the temptation to water down and go a safe route, especially in an industry like engineering or where there's a high level of conservatism. So ask yourself these questions and see if you can hone in on a name that does more than just fit in on the cards or have the highest score and really drives culture. So is it fun to say? Names that are fun to say, even if you're not necessarily offering fun as part of your brand, is an important thing. Think Google instead of Alta Vista. Alta Vista is not a fun word to say, and Google is. Is it memorable? If anything that isn't sticky, seriously, ditch it. If you need to define it endlessly, and it doesn't have that thing that makes it memorable, I would suggest considering dropping it. Is it relevant? Does it have some meaning? Does it fit in with the story and the narrative that's being told about what this firm does, what it offers, what it aspires to be? There's a grant making foundation in Seattle named Loom, which is an incredibly great name in terms of relevancy because there's a lot of foundations that are named after founders and whatever, but the idea that they're weaving change into culture and society makes this a very relevant name. Is it unique? Is it yours? Is it about you? There's only one Curious George. There's only one Dialogue. There's only one Ben Garfinkel. So find the name that you can own, and that's going to take a lot of competitive analysis. It's part of the process, but does it really feel unique? Can you back that up? Sometimes in a crowded market, filled with trends and naming, and lots of people going through this process these days, strive for a name that grabs people's attention and makes them do a double take, and consider also, is it surprising in the way it looks? As Ben said, appearance is important, but when it's applied to a word mark and a logo design, how will it grab people's attention as well? Will it work with an avatar or as a standalone word mark? Does the name capture imagination? And is it evocative? I mean, really great names convey feeling. Dialogue's a great example of that. Dialogue conveys this notion of listening, of discourse, of challenging, of talking it through, of digging deeper. Think about words like Yahoo, versus Office Depot, or Red Envelope versus 1800giftbaskets.com. I mean, there's different types of names, but you want one. Etsy. I don't even know what Etsy means, and I don't care. But if they called that website Craftsy, I just it wouldn't have worked. Etsy is evocative. And finally, the most important, the big daddy consideration, really, only you can decide if a name is right for your firm. Combining a clear understanding of brand vision and purpose and the aspirations with market research to back it up, these are critical things. These are the things we would really want our clients to let us do for them and with them. But at some point, your leadership team needs to do a gut check. And if it doesn't feel right, don't settle. Give the time it takes for the search to find the name that's going to work best for you, that's right. It'll be worth it in the end.
So talking about renaming an AEC practice in theory is certainly one thing, but we felt this topic would be best addressed by inviting a few firms to join us to discuss their own experiences in renaming their firms. Challenges of succession, ego, brand equity, retention, irrational attachment, geographic, cultural, political, and organizational challenges are just some of the things that have to be navigated.
Our first guest is Heather Smith. Heather has extensive experience leading organizations through complex strategic and tactical problems. Her role as part of the national leadership group within Architecture 49 had her most recently spearheading the reorganization of 6 architectural practices across Canada, including RCOP, AE Consultants, North 46, PBK, Smith Carter, and WHW Architects. And they all joined into one national entity and oversaw the rebranding process that went along with that. Chris Pollard is a managing partner at Ratio, and after 16 years of design and project leadership experience, along with his partner Mike Mamoni, Chris found himself leading the next generation of a 60-year-old Vancouver-based architecture and interior design firm. Originally called Toby and Russell Architects, over the years it emerged and was rebranded as TRB Architects, which is that's a typical thing that happens in the AEC sector, the acronym name choice. And then bridging the gap between respectful succession and realizing his and his partner's vision for the next 60 years of the firm resulted in undertaking a comprehensive renaming and identity for the practice in 2013. Tom Sutherland is the managing principal at DIALOG. In September 2010, the firms formerly known as Cohos Evemy, Hodson Bacher Boniface Hayden, Mole White, and Office for Urbanism announced that henceforth their collective name would be DIALOG. It was a bold move. The industry definitely noticed, and if it didn't exactly create controversy, everyone had an opinion. In many ways, this was the seminal moment for architectural practices in Canada and even North America, as Tom led the way in breaking from the mold of traditional naming convention. So let's have a conversation with these 3 folks. Tom, can you unmute yourself over there? I still see that you're on mute. Heather and Chris are good to go. I don't think I can unmute you myself. Anyway, so let's begin with a question for Tom, assuming we can get his audio working here. Tom, the names of all of the firms that joined to become DIALOG, that was a long list. And did you have something simple like the concept or the word dialogue in mind at the start of the renaming process? I think we're having some audio not entered. Tom, I think you're supposed to enter a pin hashtag 59 hashtag. Does that sound right? Why don't we switch then?
Well, let's redirect that question.
Let's redirect that question.
Heather,
yep.
When you were involved in the initial process of bringing all of those firms together, what did you guys explore in terms of what the options were going to be in terms of and how did you navigate looking at what your end goal would be there?
Well, I think, as probably is the case for most people who go through and rename, there's a huge legacy piece that has to be dealt with. And we had the legacy of 6 firms who were very happy practicing independently, and we're not trying necessarily to escape anything with their old names, which, you know, sometimes you're looking for a change for different reasons. But so I guess our where we started was we really had all practiced as part of a parent organization. We'd all been acquired over the course of 3 or 4 years, but had chosen and were given the option of operating under our original entities and our original names, which everybody chose to do because that's always the easiest thing to do. But actually, after practicing that way for a couple of years with a broader network, we really all came to the realization that in order to capture the synergies between the different brands, we really needed to be branded and named the same way. So we started off actually by looking at what were the potential options. Before we actually got to a name, it was more about a concept. We could capitalize on one of the existing firms' names and just adopt that. We could so go with an existing name. We knew we could go with a new name. We knew we could, let's say, refresh a name but use else's name, you know, Smith Carter Partners or what have you. Or we could go with a hybrid, a little bit like, you know, Air Canada does with the Star Alliance. Star Alliance represents a range of firms, but they all kind of come together under an umbrella. But so we actually took those 4 options and put them through an evaluation matrix. And in the end, even though it was probably the hardest choice, we said a new name was the way to go. And then we started going down the road of positioning first, who we are and what do we want to do for the market and where. And then we, as you know, we got into the brand development with you guys and really determined what we wanted our brand essence and our brand positioning to be before we got into the naming process. And we did that through the establishment of a steering committee, which had a representative from each of the legacy firms on board. So.
We've got
Terrific.
Tom. We
Wow.
had to do a little technical mojo here, but we got Tom back. Tom, let's go back to that original question. Did your team have the idea to be so provocative? Did you have this simple kind of name like dialogue, or that idea when you started the process?
Not at all. That's a short answer.
That's the short answer.
The longer answer would be that, and although this webinar is focused on renaming, that's actually not what we focused on at the beginning. As you heard earlier, we were merging a number of firms together. That was the impetus to do it. And so we spent a lot of time at the beginning building capacity among our partners to understand what branding was about and how naming fit into branding. And one of the things that did for us is it helped us lower the temperature and the anxiety that we would get the name right or wrong. What we focused on was first the question, should we actually rename? And we did a lot of research with the help of some outside people around that, and you know, we came upon research that had been done and presented at the marketing sciences conferences, and it really talked about the results of mergers for companies that had taken different renaming strategies and things like that. So our focus was really on brand and the role of a name in a brand, and should you rename, and what the strategies are, and how to get that process right. And we kind of went into it with the understanding after that research that it really didn't matter that much what name we came up with at the end, because, you know, the name, the way the brand works is whatever name you choose, your day-to-day service and the quality of your work puts definition into that name. I mean, that's why Apple, I mean, people think Apple is a great computer name, but it's actually a terrible name for a computer company. It's only become a great name because of a great product. And so with that kind of thinking, we lowered the temperature and we got people to buy into the process. Down the road, there was an awful lot of work. It was very hard to come up with the right name and all the things you can imagine. But I think if we hadn't focused on doing the groundwork first, I think we would have hit the ditch, quite frankly.
Right. Chris, when you and Mike, how did you come to the conclusion that rebranding and a new name was in order? What was that process like for you guys?
Well, I'd start out by paralleling some of Tom's comments. I think we before we got into, we knew we had the renaming as a sort of placeholder from the beginning. We knew we had to address it, but there was a lot of work to be done on what we felt was important, was the rebranding of our firm for the future. So our context is a little bit different in that there was no merger, no acquisition as a driver. We've been continually operating for 60 years, and Mike Mamoni and I have become the third generation of partners. The first generation of partners are now all deceased, and the second generation of partners, Mike Barnes and Tom Annandale, are still with us, but we are in our succession plan. This is their final year with the firm. So what was really, really important was bridging two things. One was the future of our firm, where we wanted to take the firm, and so when we get into certainly the rebranding, but then the eventual consideration of naming was what if in that new name we had to make sure that we were describing that the name was intuitive enough that that it captured some of the things that we felt were important going forward. Relationships were key to that, and also making sure more than anything that we were bridging for our existing clients. What was happening, that we weren't signaling a merger or acquisition, or most importantly, sort of an abrupt change of guard. So what was really important in the whole process was getting our existing clients, some of whom have been with us since the birth of our firm, on board to understand what we were doing. I guess in looking forward and looking at how we would approach new clients and how we would be seen in competitions, which is what we all do. I think it was the name itself. So Toby Russell Buckwell, all of those partners are deceased, and we did what a lot of firms did, as you mentioned. We went to an acronym that was in large part driven by our professional body, which didn't allow us to continue with the names of the original partners, unlike say in a law firm. So that was the decision that was made at that time. But as you pointed out, an acronym doesn't distinguish us from many other firms out there. In our case, we felt pretty strongly that the acronym, our particular acronym, was a little awkward and unmemorable. So we knew that going forward through this process that we wouldn't land on another acronym, and we had to, it had to be something that we were comfortable with. And as Tom was saying, I think it's something that you can get only so right when you land on a name, and it's something that you have to grow into.
Right.
That is, your brand and then I guess your name becomes recognizable for the work that you do, where we wanted to take the firm.
Terrific. That's great. We do have a question here. This is for Heather. The question is, the Architecture 49 brand associates itself as a Canadian company. Do you see that as being an issue for expanding into international markets?
That's interesting because we did talk a lot about that when we were looking at a name, and we felt no, it wasn't going to be restrictive because the 49th parallel actually runs around the world. So we wanted to use it as a unifying force for the Canadian group to start with, but we've looked at ways that we think that we can make it relevant internationally and actually capitalize on the Canadian reputation around the world. And so, no, I don't think it's going to be restrictive, but we really did think about that a lot when we were looking at it. So.
Terrific, thank you. Chris, I just wanted to ask you a question, just with respect to the outgoing partners that you've got at TRB. The two fellows, they never changed the name of the firm and added their last names to it when they took over, did they?
No, they didn't, and that's that sort of sums up the two personalities. Actually, a lot less ego than you might imagine, and for them, and they're a huge part of why this process came together so nicely, is that for them the legacy is and it was never to rename it, to attach themselves to it. Although I know at one point they considered it. They still feel a great debt to the original partners, whose, I guess, the succession plan at that time looked very similar to what's happened with us right now, without a renaming at that time. And the legacy really for Mike Barnes and Tom Annandale is to see the firm continue. And so that's what they were focused on, and that was really all they had to say about it. They were very supportive of the rebrand, and were made comfortable by the process by which we reached out to our clients and involved them very early on in it.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Tom, Ben, I have a question for Tom.
Of course, go ahead. Yeah.
Tom, there with so many firms coming together and so many principals and associates and opinions inside and outside the organization, how did you obtain consensus at the various points along the way, from the initial decision through the final stages? Where did that come from? Describe that process a little bit for us. The difficulties and how you had tackled that.
That's a good question. I can tell you it was a rather long process, and it wasn't easy. But what we tried to do was have a process that allowed time for reflection and allowed people to have time to think about things before they actually had to weigh in with an opinion. So early on, we let our staff know that we were going through this process, and we actually opened it up to the entire company for people to supply their thoughts on what the name should be. So that was one set of input. We had a committee that was of partners, a small group of partners, that was charged with working with the consultant to come up with a new name, and having a consultant involved was really important, for sure, to help steer us through it. And what happened is, as we worked through and we had, groups of names that we thought had promise, and we would have a strategic planning retreat coming up or something, we would put those names up and we would keep them up for the entire retreat, and we would ask the full partnership group to provide comments to us, not an approval, just comments, and we went through that process a number of times as we kind of worked our way through it. So by the time we got to the end and we're bringing forward a single recommendation, there had been a lot of time to think about it and a lot of time for people to reflect. And when we finally rolled it out to our staff after our partners signed off on it, there was unanimous approval at the partnership level, and there appeared to be unanimous support at the staff level at the same time. So we took our time and we kept people involved along the way, and certainly let the principals see what some of the drafts look like so they could think about it.
It's interesting when you have wall of names up and you're evaluating them, and particularly when they're no longer traditional formats of names of firm principals. A lot of the opinions that you get around the room can revolve around sort of the negative connotations of a word. You know, where people go with it is always like the devil's advocate side. Were you finding yourselves, even with the final or close selection of dialogue, in conversations like that?
Well, certainly people get emotionally invested in the process, as I think they should. And so people want to hang on to certain names for a long time, and other people react emotionally very strongly against certain other names, and then you have to decide, you know, whether some of those are hills you cannot afford to die on and they come off the list. So I think as we went along, we you know, at least partway through the process, managed to weed out some of the names that were absolute duds and no starter and were non-starters. One thing important to know about our process is that the base option was to use Koha 7E. We didn't take that off until the very end of the day, because at the end of the day, the option was going to be new name or keep Koha 7E, right? So that was what we always tested against. But actually, the way the process went was we went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names. You have to appreciate that. And when we actually got to our short list, we actually didn't like any of the names on the short list, and we actually had to open the process up again a bit more, because sometimes that happens with a committee. You kind of work the politics so much that what you end up at the end of the day is vanilla. And we got to a point where we realized we had vanilla. It was
that's vanilla. A great point.
And so we had to take a step back and say, this is just wrong. And we went back to some of our other previous options, and we actually pulled the name back off from the shelf that had been shelved early on in the process. But we saw it in a new light, and that was the name that we eventually carried forward with.
So it's good to have a sort of a mindfulness around the naming process, and not getting too caught up in the steps, and have a gut check and go, wait a second, this name isn't going to give us the sort of impact that we're looking for, because we've genericized it too much through trying to please everybody.
Yeah, it's like being quite far through the design of a building, and all of a sudden realize you missed something, and you need to go to the client and tell them, look, I know we're like way down the road here, but we've seen a different, we've had an epiphany, and we're going to recommend changing direction. And I think you have to allow that to happen, because it's not a linear process.
Yes. So you and Heather with Architecture 49 have a larger ownership group and management group that have to kind of wade through that. Chris, your experience is a little bit different. You and your partner Mike have had a little bit more autonomy within that decision. Did you have similar situation in terms of like trying to look at the names and not getting too caught up in the analysis? To the point where it was not the impact that you were looking for? Like, how did you guys handle that?
We did. I mean, the process was really eliminating. There was about, I would think, about 12 names that were on the long list, and 9 of them we did away with right away. Actually, ours was fairly simple. We were thinking about, I guess, in broader terms, before we even got to that list, about some names that had resonated with us, that were just floating around in our minds, I think, and then went through that testing process. And I think the first place you go, it's easy to, in some ways, attach too much meaning to a name, and you realize that you sort of.
Oh, Chris, we got a little bit of feedback there on you, Chris.
But when it came down to it, and as you say, Mike and I had, all
We've lost Chris a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you restate just the last sentence you said? Mike and I what?
As Ben was saying, we had sort of ultimate control over the final decision that way. And when it came down to it, we eliminated 9 names from a list of 12. We each had different favorites in that final list of 3 that each of us didn't like. The others' choices. Those were gone. There was one left that we both kind of liked that really grew on us, so that our original favorites, after we kind of worked with the name ratio, weren't even a factor. So that was our process.
So you tried it on for size. That's great.
We have a question.
Mark, are you going to ask a question?
We have a couple questions coming in here. This one is aimed to the whole panel from Netta. Thank you, Netta. Once the new name was in place and the brand was launched, what kind of reactions did you get from your clients? And how do you reinforce your new brand and keep it fresh for your market? Let's start with Heather.
Well, that's a great question, and we're still very early in our renaming process. So I would say, from our clients' perspective, we did quite a lot of client outreach right around our launch time. Our clients were really supportive of the change, although I think the thing that the clients are always the most concerned about is, who am I going to be dealing with?
Right.
And is anything going to change for me moving forward? And so for us, we tried to actually downplay the name change a little bit, because in reality it was just a name change. Our big outreach to our clients really was more around, it's the same people. Mm-hmm. You're going to be dealing with us in the same way you always have, and we're just bringing some extra support to the table. So once they understood that, and that is best done, I think, face-to-face, or at least, an email doesn't necessarily suffice, or a mailer. I think it really is what they see after the rebrand that reinforces it. So for us, downplaying the actual change of name was important, and just reassuring everybody that that things were going to be the same, basically, after the rebrand.
That reminds me, I really appreciated Tom's phrase, the statement he made earlier about how they lowered the temperature by focusing on the brand promise. And I think that's really key when you think about brand campaigns, when you're relaunching a name, a position, a tagline, an identity, and all the components that go with it. With a firm, you need to focus on what it is you're promising, what the brand stands for. The name is a very important component, but no more so or less so than a logo or any other part of it. The brand promise is what's key. Tom, how did you guys handle this? And maybe you can touch on, did you have any surprising client reactions? Were there any negative client reactions?
I'm going to echo what Heather said, and it went right back to the early research work that we did. And the reality was, the clients really didn't care what we called ourselves. The only thing they cared about was the level of service they're going to get. And because we were going through a merger as well, they had similar questions. Are we still going to get the great level of service? Will I still be able to deal with you, etc.? What we did with our launch, which maybe helps a little bit here, is we did a staged launch. We went to our internal people and told them first, and told them why. Then secondly, we spent a month going out and talking to our clients one-on-one, key clients, about the name change. And while some people might say, well, you're leaking the surprise, we actually were okay with that. We wanted to leak it. We didn't want to
a little teaser.
Right, and the reason we did that is because it gave us the opportunity to talk to these key clients face-to-face, over lunch, whatever, explain not just the new name, but the whole merger, explain why the new name, do everything we wanted to do. And therefore, we could rely on these great clients to be our advocates in after the formal launch to the market to be our advocates when we weren't there. So if you imagine, some cocktail party where somebody says, hey, did you hear about COA 7? We just changed the name, and somebody else says, well, that's really dumb, and I think Dialog is a stupid name. There's a good chance one of our clients is in there, and they can step forward and say, you know what, it's actually really smart, and I'm going to tell you why. And so that really helped a lot.
I remember when that started to go through the industry, and I bet Chris and Heather do too. We all were at those cocktail parties, and we were all in those conversations going, that's stupid, but that's brilliant. Well, and then you realize in the middle of it, damn, they did it. They got us talking about them. We're actually, all eyes are on Dialog, and it really worked in a lot of ways. There was a dialogue about Dialog. It was fantastic. I have another question here. I'm gonna move on and bounce to Chris. I'm gonna actually ask each of you in brief. You may not remember exactly, but Chris, how long did this process take for you?
The renaming?
From the whole renaming process. How long did that take?
It was, as I said, it was embedded in the brand, the rebrand. I'd say it was about a month to make a decision, but then there was a subsequent rollout, and our process mirrored Tom's, where we were going to key, and Heather's, where we were going to key clients and making. Explaining what we were doing to them.
Right. Heather, how about you guys? How long did that process take?
Well, I think that the rebrand and the rollout, plus or minus 12 months, not long enough, just for reference. There are lots of things that can push you sideways, and they're tactical things. It's not even the emotional or the buy-in piece of it. It's legal searches, it's the provincial association licensing requirements, it's the time to convert all your material. There's a lot of complexity to it that needed to take longer than what we took. It was a bit of a mad dash.
How about you, Tom?
From the time when we made a decision to actually go down the road to the time when we publicly launched the name was about 8 months, which felt about right. There was a lot of after-the-fact work with, associations and all sorts of other stuff that maybe is included in Heather's 12 months, but between those yardsticks of deciding to start and launching the name was about 8 months.
Great.
I'm going to just throw this out as well. In the wider process, when you're evaluating names, it's really interesting because you may hear some great things from people, but you could hear some negative things, either internally or externally. How you address the negative things and work through them is a really, really interesting thing, and it is different every single time. Did any of you experience a particularly notable red flag that either came up from staff or from perspective from clients or your own management group or your consultants in the process?
Well, I would say from our perspective, one of the things that ended up becoming a red flag that we hadn't probably put enough weight on, for us, our name needed to be language neutral. And it was quite startling once we got into the analysis and even the short list. Our name had to make sense in both French and English. So if anybody has that challenge in front of them, oh my gosh, that can bring back a lot of negative feedback, because what an Anglophone understands a French translation to mean is different than maybe what a Francophone might understand it to be. And so most of our struggles came from making sure we were language neutral, which I think is sort of a unique twist to what we were dealing with.
And it even becomes an issue for visual language too. You don't necessarily want to have all sorts of different logo versions in different languages.
Exactly.
That's a very good point. One we don't have to deal with our U.S. clients, thankfully. How many people were on your committees? Tom, you said you had a small committee. How, was that like 4 principals, 8? Was it?
No, what we did was we made a committee that was 3 principals from Koha SME and 3 from HBBH.
Yep.
Which, given the disparity in firm sizes, took a bit of a gut check to do that, and then I chaired it as the 7th member if the tie breaking if required, which never was required. But it was 7 of us.
7. How about you, Tom or Heather? It was how many?
We had 5 on our committee, which represented all of the larger firms, and the one representative represented the 3 smaller firms that were in his particular region. So, and that was plenty.
Chris, in your case, it was just you and Michael, right?
There were
the former partners were involved too.
So Initially, and then when they were comfortable with what we were doing, the 2 of us ran with it. I'd like to point out our firm is much smaller than Heather's and Tom's. We're 23 people together. So that what we also did was engage staff, not as designed by consensus, but we, at regular benchmarks that we decided on ahead of time, we involved them in where we were at in the process, and that was really helpful. But that made more easy, I think, by the size of our firm.
So some themes that came out of this discussion as we wrap up here, folks, some things I heard that I thought really caught my attention. I heard the phrase a couple times that clients didn't really care what we called ourselves as much as the service and the offering that they were getting, the brand promise, the level of service, who they were dealing with. I also really appreciated this notion of lowering the temperature and relieving some of the anxiety by focusing on that stuff. It was repeated in a couple of different ways by our speakers that this process isn't easy, and it can be emotional, and it needs to be done with a deliberate intent, and that a couple of times the refrain was that to make sure that you leave lots of time for reflection and research and to let the dust settle and to get comfortable with the names and really make sure that you believe, and that definitely echoes our beliefs in this process as well. Everybody mentioned that at some point, to some extent, it was opened up outside of a committee. Having a committee was important, so that design wasn't done, this whole vanilla. I think it was Tom who mentioned when too many voices are involved, this design by committee resulted in sort of some vanilla results. But opening up to the company was an important process and step in the process for everybody, and that's great. And a staged launch, making sure that internal, external, and phases in terms of how this is rolled out is important. I want to, just before I do a wrap up here, I'd like to ask everybody one last question. We have a piece. Oh, sorry, we have another question. Oh, good. It's the same question I was going to ask. Thank you, Jennifer. So Jennifer asks, is there one piece of advice or one major learning lesson that each of you would like to share with the audience? Is there something that you think that we should all take away from this? Let's start with Heather.
Oh gosh, it's hard to wrap it up with one. I would say keep it in perspective. It's about your business. It's not about the name. And if you can make sure that what you're doing with your renaming is linked to your business strategy and what your clients need, you'll be able to keep it in perspective, because it is a very emotional process, and if there is lots of personal angst tied up with the naming end of things, and it can really derail you. So focus on the clients, focus on your business model, and don't get make sure it's not grossly wrong. That was really advice somebody gave me a long time ago. As long as
make sure it's not wrong.
If you can sit across from someone with a straight face and describe what you've done, you're good. If it's grossly wrong, you'll be cringing as you're telling the story, and you'll know it.
That's great. Chris, how about you? Chris, are you there? Tom, do you want to go ahead? There's Chris.
I would say again, yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes?
Yep, go ahead.
I would say that absolutely you can't go wrong with talking with your client over and over again about what you're doing. You've got to engage them. By the time that we actually hit the go button on it, which was, by the way, only about 7 months ago. I was telling someone yesterday that it was about 1.5 years ago because it feels so comfortable now, and nobody makes a mistake of using our old name, both inside and outside, which I was expecting. But I think that was largely because when we hit the go button, our clients got it. It was so they were ready for it. It was sort of like, yeah, we've heard this before. That's fine. Let's get on with our work.
And so is your piece of, pardon me, is your piece of advice to make sure that your clients are ready for it, they're primed, and what kind of like Tom was talking about, they had hinted to the industry that this was coming. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but even right back to the beginning of the rebranding process, if that's what you're doing, I think right from the get-go we engaged them, talked about it informally, and then at regular benchmarks we discussed where we were at and where we were going. So in the end, when we launched it in January, it was sort of like, yeah, ratio, duh, that's who you guys are.
Right. Tom, and your final comments, anything to pass along to the audience, one perspective or piece of advice?
I guess my last perspective would be make sure that you're doing it for the right reason. I think people get mistaken that, new names and rebranding kind of is a panacea, and it never is. I mean, clients really know who you are, and they care about service and the quality of work and things like that. The reason we went through the process wasn't because, we didn't like the name Cohos Evamy or whatever. We went through it because it was a really important way of bringing two strong cultures, and in the case of Office for Urbanism and Moe White, 4 cultures together, and getting everybody to buy into a new platform, and having us essentially give up the name Cohos Evamy was a real demonstration that even though we were the largest entity coming into the merger, that we were as committed to everybody else's success as we wanted them to be with us. So it allowed us, it was really a merger consolidation strategy, how to get people to buy into a new entity rather than still fight for their old flags. That's why we did it. So if we didn't have that driver, we wouldn't have done it. So I would recommend that everybody make sure that you have the right driver for doing it before you invest the time and energy into it.
Excellent. The parting thoughts I were going to give to the audience were, keep it simple. It's a very complex process, but almost, Ben and I have been doing this for 20 years, and simplicity is the best names are always very simple. Make sure you do tons of research, gain insights and connections for a good name, and avoid costly mistakes. Give it the time. Don't rush. Basically, keep it simple. Do your research. Give it time. Sit on it. Try them on for size. Play with names. Set them. Say them. Typeset them. Use them in conversation. And most of all, consider your equity. Getting equity from any name takes time. So look for ways to connect the old with the new, and consider what equity is possible to retain in the process.
Okay, everybody. Well, our time is up, and I wanted to just, Mark and I both wanted to give a special thanks to Heather, Chris, and Tom for joining us today, and all of you for joining us this morning. I hope that we've given you guys some things to think about. If you want to go through this webinar again or share it, we'll be posting a capture on our site tomorrow. I've put a link for where that will be in the chat window, and look for more webinars coming up soon. Thanks again, and bye for now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.